Hello. You know who deserves more respect? Ernst Lubitsch. There's one of those famous Hollywood stories. At the funeral of Ernst Lubitsch, Billy Wilder and William Wyler were sharing a ride back from the cemetery. Billy Wilder wistfully said, "No more Lubitsch," reflecting on the loss of a friend and colleague he had worked with twice before. William Wyler, in turn, said, "Worse, no more Lubitsch movies." And I think that exemplifies a lot of the appeal of Ernst Lubitsch at the time, which would be about 1946. Ernst Lubitsch was a German import who came to America in 1923 to make a movie with Mary Pickford. And when he came to America, he was one of the most respected and admired filmmakers of the new medium. And from that point, he just grew in stature. His films were never the biggest at the box office, but Hollywood loved him. They loved the movies he made, and they found what he made to be some kind of secret sauce that no one else could replicate. I don't think that's quite true. I think both men in that original story, both Billy Wilder and William Wyler, had very good fingers on the pulse of what Ernst Lubitsch did, and they replicated him actually quite well in certain movies. But Lubitsch himself just kind of faded away from the popular consciousness. You know, we can still think of filmmakers from that time that people will remember. You know, people will remember Metropolis and Fritz Lang. People will remember Alfred Hitchcock. People will remember John Ford. All who made movies at the same time as Ernst Lubitsch. But Ernst Lubitsch is largely just forgotten. In Preston Sturges's Sullivan's Travels, there's a minor character who has come to Hollywood to try to make it with a big director, and she mentions Lubitsch. Lubitsch was a big name, and yet most casual film fans seem to have very little idea of who he is, and I find that deeply unfortunate. So my personal history with Lubitsch is I kind of had no clue who he was. I knew the remake of To Be or Not to Be, made by Mel Brooks, because my dad really liked it, and so it was one of those VHSs we always had. But I never really noted Lubitsch's name in the credits. When I started getting into movies, one of my avenues in was the Criterion Collection, and the Criterion Collection released 10 of his movies. And I never really considered it holistically until a few years ago when they released Clooney Brown, the last of Lubitsch's movies that he completed and the last of Lubitsch's movies that the Criterion Collection has released individually. It made a bit of a to-do at the time because the original cover for the movie that the Criterion Collection commissioned made the main character look like a robot, which made it look silly. They went back and they touched it up again to make her look a little less metallic. And so that little flare-up brought to mind, well, who is this Lubitsch guy? And I did a quick look through their list, and they had released 10 of them. And I was really surprised. It's like someone at this company, one of the original owners, a producer who works for them, loved Lubitsch. And it kind of stopped after that. They finally started re-releasing Eclipse sets on Blu-ray, and the second of those is the Lubitsch musical set, which has a couple of very, very good, kind of great Lubitsch movies. Anyway, and you know, I can bring up individual Lubitsch movies and people may recognize them, but the guy died 80 years ago. Is it that surprising that no one really remembers The Student Prince in Old Heidelberg or Trouble in Paradise or a handful of others. It's not a huge surprise, but it makes me sad because I just know that with every passing year, the number of Lubitsch fans grows smaller. I am an exception. I discovered him and I loved him, and I'm trying to bring my love of Lubitsch to the world. So, I think the best way to talk about Lubitsch is to talk about him across the periods of his career. The way I view it, there are 4 distinct periods of his career. There is the German period, there's the American silent period, there's the pre-code bawdy period, and then there's the mature period. And that takes us from 1916 to 1946, 30 years. And within each of these periods, there are some crossovers. Like, the most potent example is in the German period. There are 3 films that would actually fit better with the American silent period. The German period is largely defined by large romantic epics, and yet in the middle of that is The Doll, The Oyster Princess, and Wildcat, all of which are the kind of borderline silly romantic comedies that he would make in America. So let's take these periods one by one, and then I'll talk more about him overall. So starting with the German period, this is what made him famous. And I don't quite get it. I love Lubitsch overall, but the German period largely leaves me cold. Because, as I said, these are largely historical epics, and I just don't think they're terribly good. They are centered around historical figures like Anne Boleyn or Madame Bovary. And sometimes they just do kind of generalized, fictionalized versions of historical characters like Pharaoh. And I generally find them kind of dull. They are very large productions. They obviously were very large strains on UFA Studios in Weimar, Germany, especially after the end of World War I. But I just don't quite connect with them. What I do connect with in this period is those 3 films, The Doll, The Oyster Princess, and Wildcat. They're fun movies. They are romantic comedies that have kind of ornate set pieces around them as people kind of flitter through scenes, and it's about people across classes, or in the case of The Doll, people across realities. Finding love, and they are slightly naughty but always very wholesome in the end and very fun. And so those exceptions kind of stand out to me because, again, I just don't find the historical epics that engaging. In 1923, Mary Pickford started his American period when she hired him to come to America to make a movie with her. Mary Pickford was one of the 4 people who started United Artists alongside Douglas Fairbanks Sr., D.W. Griffith, and Charlie Chaplin. And so Mary Pickford was one of the most powerful people in Hollywood, and she decided that the one man to change her image from innocent waif to sexualized adult woman was Ernst Lubitsch. They disagreed on projects for a little while, eventually settling on Rosita, and it's fine. It's obvious that Lubitsch is working under the watchful eye of a major star who is trying to use him to her own ends. And it's fine, it's a fine entertainment, but it got his foot in the door. That's kind of the important thing. Mary Pickford would say at the time that Lubitsch was wonderful to work with, but decades later she would have nothing but awful things to say about Lubitsch, and she would actually try to get every copy of Rosita burned. I'm very glad she didn't do it because way too much of that period is lost already, and we didn't need Ernst Lubitsch's first American film to be another one that was lost. From that assignment with Mary Pickford and United Artists, Lubitsch signed a contract with Warner Brothers where he made a handful of films. However, I think real note has to start with when he was working at MGM. After he finished his contract with Warner Brothers, he moved to MGM under the star producer Irving Thalberg. Irving Thalberg has one actual movie credit, and it's posthumous, but he was extremely active on productions through the entire process, from pre-production through post-production. He micromanaged MGM's product. However, When Thalberg's own fiancée, Norma Shearer, complained to Thalberg about how Lubitsch was running rehearsals, Thalberg simply said, if Lubitsch does it that way, it must be the correct way. And that exemplifies the amount of respect that Lubitsch had already gained in the industry. So from his German period through the first few films of his American period, Lubitsch was creating this impression that he knew what he was doing and the final product was going to always be worthwhile. And so his silent period the entire silent period is actually largely dominated by a professional relationship with his main writer, Hans Kraly. I'm not a biggest fan of Hans Kraly. It's across all of his works. I usually find Kraly to be some sort of limitation. And yet, ironically, Kraly is a writer on my favorite Lubitsch film, The Student Prince in Old Heidelberg. So, however, I just feel like once the relationship with Kraly ended in 1930, Lubitsch found out that Kraly and Lubitsch's wife were having an affair, so he just ended everything between both of them. And Lubitsch was able to work with other writers more consistently, people like Samuel Raphaelson. He ended up with more consistent output. And I think his highs ended up getting more consistently higher. I think that ended up being the thing. However, the biggest change, though, was the transition to sound. With the advent of sound came the advent of a new movie genre, the musical.
I'm ultramarine, be sentimental, but don't act like a threshing machine.
And the very first sound film that won Best Picture was a musical. It's Broadway Melody of 1929. And Broadway Melody of 1929 is an awful movie. I genuinely dislike it. However, in the same year, Ernst Lubitsch released The Love Parade, which is a remarkable contrast between how, kind of hack Hollywood was dealing with the sound transition and how Ernst Lubitsch dealt with the sound transition. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on people who managed the sound transition poorly. The sound transition was extremely difficult. It was extremely disruptive. If you've ever seen Singing in the Rain for the comic version, or Babylon for the kind of auteur-driven, overindulgent version, the sound era was difficult to get into. Production processes had to change completely. The actual idea of how to use sound properly, how to capture sound properly, just the ideas of it were foreign to everyone who had been working in movies for 15 to 20 years. D.W. Griffith, king of the silent era, completely floundered so badly in the sound era. He made 2 sound movies. They're both terrible, and he just stopped making movies. John Ford had been making feature films for almost 15 years, and his first sound film is an embarrassment. He was directing actors while the camera was rolling, feeding them lines. They were set in their ways. And so when I find someone who enters into the sound era at the time, being able to manage things well, I'm always perking up. Howard Hawks managed it really well. His first sound film is Lost, but his second, The Dawn Patrol, is very accomplished. The Love Parade by Lubitsch, though, is amazing. It is amazingly complex, and it all has to do with the fact that sound had to be captured on set, and there was no sound mixing. You could splice film so that you could take the soundtrack from one shot and put it onto another. That was kind of, complicated, but you could do it, and Fritz Lang would do that in M in 1931 in Germany. But what Lubitsch did was all captured live, and so he has singing, he has dancing, he has orchestras, and they're all being captured at the exact same time. And he cross-cuts. There is a moment in one of the musical numbers in The Love Parade where he cuts from, as a pair of characters go from one part of the set to another part of the set. He cuts between cameras. And the sound is continuous across them. It's in the middle of a musical number. They stop singing for that cut, but the song continues, and the song is consistent. And that seems like nothing today. I can do that. And that means nothing. If I can do it, that means nothing. But in 1929 and 1930, that was incredibly difficult to pull off. It required an incredible level of vision and planning and technical know-how that Lubitsch had, and I genuinely haven't seen from anyone else in the time. People like to throw up Alfred Hitchcock's first sound film, The Partial Talkie Blackmail, as a great example because he did some experimental stuff. There's that great moment where the main character is looking at a knife and the soundtrack just kind of dies out until all she can hear is the word knife.
Now, mind you, a knife is a difficult thing to handle. I mean, any knife. A knife. Knife. Knife.
Alice, cut us a bit of bread, will you?
Which is great. However, that film also has those really dull long shots of people just kind of talking in inanities to each other. And it's, yeah, he had that one moment, but at the same time, he wasn't able to really figure out how to work it into the rest of the movie. And Lubitsch, The Love Parade feels like a musical made in like 1935. That's how advanced it is. And that is how Lubitsch introduced himself to the sound world, by helping to create the musical genre and showing how complicated he could do it. And it's incredible. And then this is kind of the height of his entire period. My favorite film is in the American Silent period, but my favorite period is the pre-Code bawdy period. This is where he partnered with Maurice Chevalier and Jeanette MacDonald to make a series of musicals, mostly based on librettos from, Austria. They're all about cross-class love affairs. Usually Chevalier is playing the lower class person trying to bed Jeanette MacDonald, who is the upper class person. And Maurice Chevalier was unbelievably charming, and he just carries every single scene. He and Jeanette MacDonald have incredible chemistry across all of their films. And they're just wonderful examples of the musical romantic genre. And Lubitsch was just pounding them out. One a year. Another one, another one, another one. I don't love everything in here. Something like Monte Carlo I feel like is a little miss. There's also 1 Hour With You, which is a remake of one of his silent films called The Marriage Circle. And 1 Hour With You, I think, gets the tone wrong. It makes it a little too serious, which makes the ending feel off. However, the bulk of his period is marvelous, and I love it. However, the Hays office asserted control in 1934. There was no way that Ernst Lubitsch was going to be able to continue his bawdy musicals, which included things like beds in private rooms at restaurants, which heavily implied that the restaurant itself was a brothel of some kind. It's like, no, the Hays Code is not going to allow that crap. Not at all. And so he has a small transition period. There's a movie called Angel that is actually just a straight drama starring Marlene Dietrich, which is actually quite good. It's not my favorite Lubitsch by any measure, but it is quite good. And this is where Lubitsch quickly turns and he quiets down and he becomes the mature filmmaker. This is where things like The Shop Around the Corner are. The Shop Around the Corner feels like it comes from a completely different filmmaker than the man who made The Merry Widow, The Smiling Lieutenant, and The Love Parade. It is a quiet, romantic comedy drama about two people learning to connect. It was very famously remade as You've Got Mail in the 90s with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. But in this instance, it was Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan connecting through pen pal letters, but then hating themselves in real life, and then discovering affection as the wall of masquerade between them falls apart. And at the same time, it is a love letter to the kind of city that Lubitsch grew up in. It's set in Budapest, but it could feel like, Vienna or Berlin, where Lubitsch grew up. And so the actual shop feels like a place that Lubitsch knew. The side characters are all wonderful. I always love seeing Frank Morgan in pictures, and Lubitsch used Frank Morgan more than once, and it's always wonderful to see. And it's also a wonderful Christmas movie at the same time, so perfect time for Christmas. Merry Christmas. And in this period, he's just continuing to refine himself over time. You know, I don't necessarily need filmmakers to change. I don't need them to stay the same. I'm just happy with how they make movies as long as they entertain me. And I find Lubitsch interesting because he was refining based on external factors. He was refining because the Hays Code told him, you can't make those movies anymore. He refined into the musical because the silent films just didn't work anymore. You can actually see the bawdy period as something of kind of a detour because the student prince in Old Heidelberg feels like it belongs in the mature period. And so this evolution, this refinement over time, it crescendos with things like The Shop Around the Corner, Ninotchka, To Be or Not to Be, and Heaven Can Wait. These are all very mature, comedic dramas about romance, and they feel almost sedate in comparison. I would never call them actually sedate, just within comparison to his bawdy period. They are sedate because he calms everything down, and he's more focused on kind of deepening character. Whereas the bawdy pre-code period is just a celebration of excess and fun, his mature period is a period where he celebrates characters and really explores how they connect. And it's wonderful. However, Lubitsch was not a well man towards the end of his life. Otto Preminger actually finished 2 of his films, A Royal Scandal and That Lady in Ermine. Preminger actually refused credit on That Lady in Ermine out of respect for Lubitsch, although Lubitsch only directed 8 days of That Lady in Ermine. And Lubitsch actually didn't direct any of A Royal Scandal. He took everyone through pre-production, he cast everyone, he built the sets, but then he just was not physically able to actually get through production, so he handed it over to the executives at Fox who chose Preminger to finish things. There was one movie in the middle there, that's Clooney Brown. I talked about it a little bit ago. It is the final movie that he completed entirely on his own, and it is a very nice little film. Like most of Lubitsch's films, it is a delight. It is a minor delight in comparison to his best work, but it is just a gentle ribbing of the English ethos and sense of propriety, while filling the movie with double entendres about plumbing, which obviously is talking about male-female relations. And so that's his career. It's this evolution over time where he helps build genres, both the musical and the romantic comedy. He's able to change countries and just retain respect as he's able to just do what he wanted. And, you know, again, his movies were consistent moderate successes. They were never huge successes. And so they were successes enough so that Hollywood's fans of him could continue to give him work, which was always important. And yet his health ended up failing him and he died. And I feel like he died way too early. He was born in 1892. He died when he was about 55 years old. And he probably imagined a world where he had been able to live into the 50s and 60s, being able to kind of wait out until the end of the studio era in the 60s, just continuing to make another 5 to 10 more films. And I think they would have been wonderful films, but we were denied that, and instead I have this marvelous wealth of entertainment to get me through, and I absolutely love his body of work. As I said, I'm not the biggest fan of his German period, but there is stuff in there that I really like, but the rest of it, just very good to great. I'm so happy with so much of it. And so what do you do with someone like Ernst Lubitsch? You know, he has no distinctive visual style, so the film bros out there have no real interest in him. All they want is people influenced by German Expressionism if they're going to think about someone old. They want to be able to look at a film by a particular filmmaker and say, that's it. That's that guy's. Just based on that one frame, I know that's that guy's work. And I always find it to be a frustrating way to look at how to interpret film, how to enjoy film, really. And because there's so much more that goes into film than visual distinctiveness. You can film classically and well, which Lubitsch does, while having incredible technical skill, as you can see through his musical period, while at the same time having incredibly distinctive ways of telling stories. And for Lubitsch, that was almost all the romance across classes, where the classes would ultimately not matter because Maurice Chevalier, who was the most charming mother on the planet, was going to win Jeanette MacDonald's heart no matter what. They were fantasies. They were joys of fantasies where people discovered the strength of the human heart, but we had a slightly naughty time along the way. And I just want to take a little bit in the end to talk about his influence. So Lubitsch is one of those who doesn't have a very strong visual influence, and so people kind of dismiss him 80 years after his death. You know, I can bring up individual movies and people will say, oh, I've heard of that and I liked it, but then if you want to try to dig them deeper into Lubitsch's filmography, it's be like, oh, maybe I'll discover that later. There seems to be no real energy to it, and then it's largely forgotten. And yet, his influence is incredibly deep. As I had mentioned in the very beginning, Billy Wilder and William Wyler were massive, massive fans. Wilder wrote 2 of his films. He wrote Blackbeard's Eighth Wife, and he wrote Ninotchka. Ninotchka is one of Lubitsch's most famous films. And Wilder adored him. And Wilder actually applied everything that he learned from Lubitsch in most of his films. A lot of the plot movement in Lubitsch's films is based on people pretending to be other people. It's masquerade, and Billy Wilder uses that a whole lot. You know, you can think of the most potent example being Some Like It Hot, where Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon pretend to be women. You know, so that's the most extreme form of masquerade as an influence from Lubitsch. And I actually feel like The Apartment would be kind of the best Lubitsch movie if Lubitsch had made movies into the early 60s. And at the same time, you have William Wyler. Now, Wyler is mostly known for Ben-Hur. You know, Wyler is another one of those filmmakers that is kind of pushed to the side and forgotten. When he's brought up, it's in favor of individual films and never him holistically. He had very distinct visual stylings, but they weren't influenced by German Expressionism, so they end up feeling kind of generic. They're not. They're actually really complicated. However, what's important is the fact that Wyler actually made Lubitsch tribute movies. The Good Fairy, Roman Holiday, How to Steal a Million, and a few others are all Lubitsch homage movies. They are movies where William Wyler is making his love of Ernst Lubitsch incredibly loud and clear. And again, The Good Fairy, which was written by Preston Sturges, is one of my favorite Ernst Lubitsch movies that Ernst Lubitsch never made. I think it's like number 5 or something in my ranking of William Wyler films. I love it a lot. And you think of The Shop Around the Corner and its conventions around romantic comedies and how the 90s Hollywood just straight up remade it, and it fit perfectly into that sort of 90s Tom Hanks, Meg Ryan milieu. And it's just Ernst Lubitsch put into the 90s with email instead of pen pals. That's kind of all it is. And his influence is incredibly deep. He helped figure out the early sound era. He helped define the musical. He helped define the romantic comedy. But you know what? He doesn't use shadows a lot, so why pay attention to him? You know why you should pay attention to him? Because he made great movies. Ernst Lubitsch was one of the masters of the form in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. He absolutely was. He knew exactly what he was doing, he knew exactly what he wanted, and he knew exactly how to get it. And I feel like more people should learn to appreciate Ernst Lubitsch as this great entertainer who brought us music, who brought us laughter, and who brought us genuine emotion. The film community over time tends to dismiss people who make comedies. They tend to dismiss people who weren't visually distinctive. But you know what? Ernst Lubitsch was great, and you should watch more of them.